Hello there, I'm Manila Chan. You're watching In Question, broadcasting from RT America's national news headquarters in Washington, D.C. Here are today's top stories. First, Israel unleashing another series of airstrikes on Gaza City. It's the latest escalation after a bloody weekend on the Strip. Next, our panel guest answers the question, why are world powers not intervening in this bloodshed? Then, could the U.S. have blood on its hands in this latest Mideast conflict? My next guest explains the reason behind the DoD's ironclad support for Israel. And finally, China successfully landing on the red planet, Mars. Next, we'll detail their plans of space exploration. All right, it's time to boost your news IQ. There seems to be no end in sight in the latest round of fighting between Israeli forces and Hamas. The conflict started about 2 weeks ago after violence broke out when Israeli authorities in East Jerusalem pushed to evict Palestinian families in order to make way for Jewish settlers. Now, an international call to stop the ongoing bloodshed is falling on deaf ears as Israel vows to push forward. Alex Mihailovich has more.
As Israel's Iron Dome takes out rockets fired by Hamas, a new day brings fresh Israeli strikes to the Gaza Strip as the current round of violence enters its second week.
Entire families were exterminated and their homes were demolished on top of their children by the brutal raids that spread death, terror, and human remains in the rubbles of destroyed buildings and streets.
The Palestinian death toll is approximately 200, including 59 children.
They are children. They are 2, 3, 4 years old. What did they do that made it necessary to kill them? What are the targets the Israelis were after? They targeted their missiles at small children who did nothing wrong. They were torn to pieces.
Adding to the dead, over 1,200 Palestinians have been injured in what some are calling unprecedented attacks. A journalist on the ground reporting for RT described the scene.
Israeli intensive airstrikes are killing women and children inside their homes. And it is important to note that Israel did not send a pre-warning for these buildings before they bombarded them, which is something unprecedented, as Israel used to warn the people before they attempted to strike any building.
On the Israeli side, there have been at least 10 deaths, including a 5-year-old boy, all killed by Hamas rockets. While much of the world is asking for a ceasefire to end the bloodshed, including some at the UN,
the most urgent and pressing task at this moment is to cease fire and stop violence.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not ready to comply.
Our battle against the terror organization continues in full force. We are charging very heavy prices from Hamas for their unbearable aggression. The IDF carried out attacks on more than 1,500 targets during the last days.
According to the Israeli military, it has destroyed 15 kilometers of militant tunnels and the homes of 9 Hamas commanders. In addition, this airstrike is said to have taken out Hassam Abu Harbid, the commander of the Northern Division of Islamic Jihad. On Saturday, President Joe Biden spoke with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, calling on Hamas to cease rocket fire into Israel. In addition, today, Abbas met with a U.S. diplomat in Ramallah. Biden also talked to Netanyahu, reiterating his strong support for Israel's right to defend itself, while raising concerns about the safety of journalists in the war zone. Over the weekend, an office tower which housed several international media organizations was destroyed by the IDF. Netanyahu and Israeli military officials said they've transmitted intelligence to the United States, which shows Hamas was using the building for their operations. However, the U.S. Secretary of State, while on a visit to Denmark, countered that claim.
I've not seen any information provided, and again, to the extent that it is based on intelligence, that would have been shared with other colleagues, and I'll leave that to them to assess.
International efforts to stop the violence are being blocked as U.S. representatives to the United Nations continue to obstruct efforts by other countries who are asking for a joint statement from the UN Security Council, which would condemn the violence and calls for a truce. For RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
And for reaction to the latest airstrikes in Gaza, I was joined earlier by our panel today. Ariel Gold, she's the National Code Director of Code Pink and a U.S. Mideast foreign policy expert, and John Jordan, he's a political commentator and former naval intelligence officer. Here's our conversation.
Well, Israel is out to finish Hamas. They're out to send a message right now that they're going to prosecute this to the end, and they're not going to put up with the rocket attacks anymore. No more proportional tit for tat. That Israel is in the counterterrorism business for real here. Secondly, Israelis want to send a message worldwide that they take their own national security very seriously, and this has implications for Iran. And what they're basically saying by not saying it is that should Iran continue its path towards a nuclear weapon, that Israel will not sit idly by. So this is sending a message worldwide to Israel. And the idea is it raises the stakes with other world powers that to prevent a conflagration, a broader conflict in the region, that Iran needs to stop with the rocket launches and all of the problems in Syria, Iraq, and so forth, and halt its ballistic missile program.
Well, what about our president, though, with his phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu? I'm sure he had an opportunity to apply some pressure to reduce this violence, but he didn't choose that tack.
Well, the Biden administration is indirectly responsible. By releasing the $6 billion to the Iranians, where did it go? It went right to Hamas to replenish their stockpiles. I mean, there's almost, the timing is too perfect. I mean, you relax sanctions on Iran and Hamas acts up. So by showing weakness and showing the soft underbelly to the Iranians, you invited this sort of thing. The Iranians desperately need to change the course of events in the Middle East. Until, obviously, for decades, it was the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian question that dominated. But recently, it's become Iran versus everybody else. So many Arab states have seen Iran as an existential issue. But the Iranians obviously need to change this. Their economic fortunes are in rapid decline. Well, until recently, with Biden relaxing them, needs to stir up the Arab-Israeli question to make it politically difficult for the Arab states to continue their rapprochement with Israel.
Ariel, can I get your response to that? Do you see a tie between what's happening with the Iranian funds being unfrozen, the assets being unfrozen a couple weeks ago, to this escalation in violence?
What I see as a tie to this escalation in violence is the provocations that were carried out by the Israeli government and by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We are looking at the forced removal of Palestinians from their homes in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Skeikh Jarrah. We are looking at barricades being put up outside Damascus Gate to impose on freedom of religious practice for Palestinians. We are looking at the Israeli military bursting into Al-Aqsa Mosque on the holiest night of the holiest holiday of the Islamic calendar. And then all of a sudden Israel says, oh my God, I can't believe they're so upset with us. Now, the reality currently is that Hamas has been asking for a ceasefire, and Israel is refusing to cease their horrific bombings. They are bombing residential buildings. They are bombing buildings that house international media. They have bombed the main road to the main hospital. Let's remember that even before this all started, Gaza has been in a 14-year-long siege. Israel controls everything that goes in and out of the country. Even before this, Gazans were getting about 8 to 12 hours a day of electricity. Now, with Israel's aerial bombardment, they're down to, 8 to 12 hours. They're down to 1 to 3 hours now. Let's also not forget that before all of this started, the hospitals in Gaza were already crowded because of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're currently putting patients in the hallways because they have nowhere to put them. And that's after they search under the rubble in hopes of finding survivors.
John, I'll let you get in there. It sounds like you want to respond.
Well, first of all, Hamas has a rich history of embedding their operations in and around civilian areas. Hamas basically employed the human shield tactic for a long time. So what Hamas will do is they will launch these rockets, launch these attacks against Israeli civilians, and then they will embed their leadership, their command and control, and oftentimes their weapon storage in areas which are difficult to get to, so that there are casualties when Israel has to deal with it. So this is Hamas is doing this. Hamas is doing this in and amongst civilians, always has, and then cries victim to the world. A very easy way out of this is, how about they just don't launch rockets at Israeli civilians?
Well,
how about
go ahead.
Israel does not drop bombs on Palestinian children. And again, we are looking at about over 200 casualties, the majority of them civilians, in Gaza right now, compared to less than 10 inside Israel. This is incredibly disproportionate. And I just want to refute your Hasbara Israeli talking points about Hamas using Palestinians as human shields. Gaza is the third most densely populated place on earth. And if we look at the bombing of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera building that took place, I believe it was on Saturday, both of those reporters from both of those news stations have spoken out and clearly saying they have been in that building for 15 years and they never saw a sight of a Hamas asset. But this is Israel's way of silencing
that story was debunked, actually, by the
war
way.
crimes that they are committing.
All right, folks. Unfortunately, I got to leave it right there. A lot more to talk about. I don't, unfortunately, see this violence de-escalating anytime soon. We'll have you both back. John Jordan, Ariel Gold, thank you so much for joining us today. Well, many are criticizing Israel's response to Hamas rockets being volleyed their way. Israel's own Iron Dome missile defense system is one of the best in the world, with over 90% accuracy. Now, couple that with offensive weapons often sold by the U.S., Israel is by far the most protected country in the Middle East. For more on this, I was also joined earlier by former Pentagon official Mike Maloof. Here's what he had to say.
You have the very strong Israeli lobby in the United States that insists upon it. And you always hear the rhetoric out of any administration that it is a bastion of democracy surrounded by 16 hostile countries. So so with that picture painted, we feel that it's one of the democracies that we help establish, when in fact it's not the type of democracy that we attribute to the U.S., given how they've treated the Palestinians and how the United States regards or how the Israelis have conducted themselves, particularly in their what appears to be an apartheid approach that they learned very, very well from the Nazis, who committed them to the very same treatment during World War II. So I'm appalled, because I also hear claims by the Israelis, even to this day, of calling for Lebensraum on the West Bank. Lebensraum is a trigger word that the Nazis used for their acquisition of territory in Europe. And wow. I think that it's astounding that we still regard them as a democracy when in fact they're not.
Wow, those are some strong points and words that you just made, Mike. Well, further to that, being that you have a DoD background, why does the DoD find Israel so important to their geopolitical strategies? I mean, just a moment ago, we heard John Jordan, who you've been on a panel with, say that there was a link in timing to Iran's releasing of their frozen funds to this, fighting that we're seeing now in the past week.
Mm-hmm. Well, Netanyahu is sending a message, and neither the Biden administration's really not in control of this latest dust-up. Netanyahu is, and he knows that he doesn't have a lot of support from the Biden administration for his own personal longevity and political survival. And the timing of all of this was very impeccable. When you look at the timeline being the Al-Aqsa raid that the Israelis did on the, as your previous person said, about on the evening of the most holy of their Ramadan night, on Eid. It was, and Netanyahu at the same time had just lost his timing to form a new government. And Lapid, who was asked to do that, has had to suspend his formation of a government in light of this latest crisis. So this fits into Netanyahu's narrative. He benefits from this. And to get back to your original question, the DoD looks upon Israel as a military ally, and again, this is because of its opposition to Iran. And I will add that Jordan was partially correct in my view when he said that this is a message to Iran. It is, because the Israelis regard Hamas as another instrument, like Hezbollah, of the Iranians, supplying financing and logistics. And this is all a prelude to a national emergency ultimately going to be declared if Netanyahu continues on this course. Nobody's in control. The UN can't do anything. The Russians have proposed a quartet of the U.S., Russia, UN, and EU to come together and try to resolve this thing. It's been rejected by Netanyahu. So that tells you Netanyahu is in the driver's seat.
Yeah. And lastly, Mike, real quick, if we want to compare, Trump to Biden, we know where Trump would fall on this. He would be squarely on the side of Bibi. But do you think Trump's Abraham Accords played a role in emboldening Israel in this latest round of fighting?
I think it did one thing. It basically had the Arab countries remain silent as Israel has now gone after the Palestinians. And you're not hearing a peep out of the other Arab countries. Yeah. And so I think it's because there is a fundamental alliance among them all. Again, their sights are set on Iran as the bad guy. You have Saudi Arabia wanting to extend its influence back into the Middle East, and it will need Israel to do that, particularly when it comes to trying to get back into Lebanon and into Syria. It's a real muddled mess, but we see a pattern of behavior emerging from all of this.
Well, Mike, one thing I've always learned from you is that as soon as the weather gets warm, the blood begins to hit the ground. So unfortunately, you are right.
It's going to get worse.
You are right every time. Mike Maloof, always appreciate your expertise. Thank you.